you so much for your contribution, Dylan. Okay, let's move along to the next pack. We have a Vero who is at 100 HP and knows peck and drill run. We've got a Cutie Fly that's got 30 HP and knows fly around. Ooh, we've got a Hollow Litten that has 60 HP and knows combustion. We have an Alolan Meowth. What's this? Have I caught you watching someone else's content? Well, that just won't do. Don't worry, I'm in control now. Welcome back to Art Practice ASMR.
Ghost in the Shell standalone complex is the franchise's first foray into TV anime. And although standalone complex shares the same voice cast with the movies, it actually takes place in a completely separate continuity, and the anime goes in a very different path than the movies. And because of those differences, fans were initially skeptical about the series, but after 2 seasons and a TV movie, fans hold Ghost in the Shell standalone complex in a similar reverence to the original movies. Standalone Complex is a sci-fi political thriller that follows the same cast we've come to know from the movies, with some additions to Section 9. The first season is split into 2 kinds of episodes. There are standalone episodes, which follow different investigations held by Section 9. And then there are complex episodes, which deal with Section 9's investigation of the Laughing Man hacking incidents. Season 2 is split into 3 kinds of episodes. There are individual episodes, which deal with Section 9's investigation of the individual 11 terrorist attacks. Then there are dual episodes, which are about a shady government intelligence group. And then there are individual episodes, which are a lot like the standalone episodes from the first season, except these tie more into the plot. And then there is the final movie, which tells Section 9's investigation of the Solid State Society. There are a lot of things that make Standalone Complex a very unique entry in the Ghost in the Shell franchise, and I've already mentioned one of them, which is how they divide up their episodes. This was something that I had never seen done in another anime before, and honestly, during Season 1, it really confused me. Because when you look at the synopsis on other websites, it only lists the Laughing Man storyline, so I had no idea that there would be a lot of episodes that just don't have anything to do with the Laughing Man arc. And there are actually way more standalone episodes than complex episodes, and they just mix them all together, so you don't really know what kind of episode you're gonna get, unless you look at the title card. And this was something that I wish I knew about beforehand, because there's actually a compilation movie of the series where it only shows the Laughing Man stuff, and I think I would have rather watched that instead of Season 1. But I can't say the same for Season 2, because Season 2 was actually very, very great. Season 2 mixed their slice of life episodes in very well, and they had them interact with the plotline in ways that were actually very interesting to see. Another thing that makes Standalone Complex so unique is how it handles its adaptation of the source material compared to the original movie. The 90s Ghost in the Shell movie and Standalone Complex are both inspired by the same manga written by Masamune Shirow, but the way they handle their adaptations are very different from each other. As I said in my last Ghost in the Shell video, the movie adapts a very specific storyline from the manga, and it adapts the main cast, but it leaves out some characters. And the movie adapts the themes of the manga, but it drastically changes the tone of the manga to something way more serious. What makes Standalone Complex so unique is how it's able to accurately adapt the manga without actually adapting any specific story from it. For example, the roster of the movies is much smaller than the roster of the show, and that's because they adapt most, if not all, of the characters from the manga. Section 9 has a much larger cast of people. You have the characters who appeared in the original movies, like Chief Aramaki, Major Kusanagi, Bato, Togasa, and Ishikawa. But then you have characters who appeared in only the manga, such as Paz, Saito, Borma, and the Tachikoma, who we'll get into later, actually. I think the reason only Standalone Complex would have been able to have all these characters was because of the format. Standalone Complex is a multi-episode TV series, and that means they have several episodes to establish and talk about these new characters. But the movie was initially planned to only be one movie. They didn't know that they were going to make Innocence, so they left out several characters that they wouldn't be able to approach in that movie. Even though I don't really like the standalone episodes from Season 1, it's because of these episodes that the TV series is able to maintain a much larger roster than the movies are. These episodes all focus on specific characters in standalone investigations, and they do a good job of establishing how characters act and think. And they're actually very close to the way the manga was written. The manga is a series of comedic slice-of-life stories intercut between action and drama with a main plotline. And that's something that was left out of the movies. And I don't really blame the movies for leaving all that out, because there's only so much you can fit in an hour and a half. But there is an experience that's being missed because of that. Speaking of missed experiences, but there is an entire comedic element of the manga that is just completely absent in the movies. I'm not saying that Standalone Complex is particularly funny, even though it does have its moments, but there is an entire heartwarming aspect of the show that can be very sweet. And oftentimes it just comes from the characters having fun with each other and having fun at work. But a lot of these moments can be chalked up to these characters called the Tachikoma. If you're familiar with the manga, there are these characters in there called Fujikoma, and they're basically these intimidating spider tanks that have a very childlike AI in them. And in Standalone Complex, they make up for most of the comedy. And it's mostly their childlike worldview that they have that's very funny. They even add an element of slapstick comedy to the show. Now, these characters are actually present in the movies, but they are completely without personality. In the movies, these characters are the spider tanks in the first and second movies towards the end of them. And they appear less as characters and more as just vehicles. And that's something that's pretty interesting on how it was lost or changed through adaptation. Even in Standalone Complex, Complex, the Fujikoma appear twice as the Tachikoma and eventually as the Uchikoma. And I thought that was actually pretty interesting. Another interesting difference between the adaptations was how they both handle their adaptation of the manga's themes. The original movies are very well known for their philosophy about what it means to be human, and Standalone Complex does approach that, but it's through the eyes of the Tachikoma, who are AI without a ghost. And I think they give it a very interesting, childlike approach, but I did prefer how it was done in the movie. That being said, the main themes of Standalone Complex are actually rooted in politics, especially for the second season, which deals with a refugee crisis. I found this season to be very interesting, especially given today's political climate. There are a lot of countries that are having an influx of immigrants, and they are all handling them in very different ways. And I think the season 2 of Standalone Complex expresses that in a very interesting way. They have Japan go through an immigrant crisis from the Third World War, and they show the immigrant crisis from several different angles. They have people who work in the government, but they even have civilians. And most interestingly, they have people who are aiding the immigrants. I think the look from different angles is what makes this season so good. It really shows how humans can let fear control them, and how people can kill their fellow man because they're so worried about invisible problems that might not even exist. And it does a good job of showing how a disconnect can cause people to villainize each other. I think this season would be very eye-opening for a lot of people for many different reasons. And I definitely recommend Standalone Complex for that reason alone. The fact that Standalone Complex allows its characters to embrace their humanity is something that sets the series apart from its movie counterparts. In the movies, the characters act very cold and distant from each other, and even characters who aren't cyborgs still act robotic. And that's definitely because of the neo-noir aesthetic of the movies, and it definitely works for them. But I don't think it would have worked for the series if they wanted to stand on their own. Luckily, the series adopted some aspects of the manga that helped it feel more human. I've already talked about the comedy in the series, but there's something that surprised me about the manga and how it was interpreted for the series. In the manga, Mokoto Kusanagi is a very sexual person. She's either bisexual or pansexual, and she actually has several sex scenes in the manga that were very controversial. And that is almost completely absent from the original movies. In the movies, the most sexual thing she does is just be naked all the time. And even though it is sexualization, it's a different kind of sexualization, because it still felt very sterile and cold. But in Standalone Complex, the characters are shown to be very sexual and to have relationships with each other. Major Kusanagi is shown several times going on dates with her girlfriends, or just laying in bed with them. And although there's a lot left to your imagination, it still tells you a lot about her character. And it's not just her who has this added to her. There are so many scenes dealing with Bato that show his sexual tension with the Major, and they just add more depth to him. And even for characters like Togasa, where they show him with his wife and daughter, actually his family is a huge part of the Solid State Society movie, and they make these characters seem much more real than they are in the original movies. even though you don't get origin stories for most of these characters, they still have things that you can latch onto and identify with. And I think that's something that's a very important aspect of the series. It just makes you feel for the characters. And now we've gotten to that point of the video where I've just run out of things to say. Or I do have things I can say, I just have no idea how to work them in here. I did like the aesthetic of the show and how it felt like a future that could exist in our timeline, if that makes sense. In the movies, they had a really cool 1920s retro futurism aspect, and I thought it really worked for those movies. But compared to the TV show, it kind of seems ridiculous in a way. Like, it seems so over-exaggerated, but still very aesthetically pleasing. I just sort of preferred how the show was able to make a future that seems like it could have existed, even though all of the characters still have flip-phones. Another thing about the series, I've just mentioned the Solid State Society movie, and I was very surprised at how well done this movie was. I didn't really know what to expect, but I expected the animation to be on par with the TV animation, but they actually really stepped it up for the movie, and I kind of think that the movie looked more beautiful than the two original movies. It had a lot of like punch zoom shots or shaky cam kind of shots, and I really liked the way it was done. Yeah. This part's a little underwhelming, isn't it? I really have no idea what I'm saying. If you're wondering why I'm not using any of my new art supplies from my other video, that's because I filmed this footage way before I filmed that. So, at the time of making this, all I had were my colored pencils. But I actually really like how this turned out. And if you saw my first anniversary video, I actually showed off this picture as my benchmark. I'm just really proud with it. I really like the coloring and the shading on it. Anyway, the video's about to end, so I just want to say thank you for watching. Thank you to Selkie Spirit ASMR for the opening, and I hope you have a good night's rest. Goodbye.